Imagine a modern global war, but without the smoke of gunpowder. The battlefield is not in muddy trenches, but inside air-conditioned server rooms in Manhattan, the City of London, and Chiyoda, Tokyo. The weapons are not missiles, but cross-border fiber optic cables, transmitting trillions of dollars per second. From 1994 to 1998, a perfect storm in financial history swept the globe. Mexico, Thailand, Indonesia, Russia, and Brazil, these economic rising stars that were once dancing a brilliant waltz on the international stage, were precisely hunted and plundered one by the exact same force within just a few short years. Do you think this was St. George Soros's personal villain script? Or merely a speculative game gone wrong for a few developing nations? No. If we zoom out to the global macro mainline, you will see a global capital hunting chain interwoven by the breathing of the Federal Reserve, the liquidity injection of the Bank of Japan, the scent of Wall Street vultures, and the frenzy of globalization. Welcome to the real undercover warfare of international finance. Today, through a genuinely global lens, we decode the underlying programming of this massive plunder. The story begins with the dimensionality reduction attack by the Western world on the global economic order. In 1989, Washington's think tanks prescribed a potent medicine for Latin American countries trapped in debt crises, the famous Washington Consensus. The core of this consensus, translated into Wall Street slang, is dismantle all financial firewalls. Mainstream Western economic circles sold a near-utopian concept to the world. Capital should be as free as the wind. Whether it's currency, trade, or capital flows, governments should let go and allow the sacred hand of the market to guide funds to where yields are highest and potential is greatest. It sounds like a win-win piece of genius engineering, doesn't it? But from the perspective of global strategy, it resembled a Trojan horse of financial liberalization. Mature, hypercapital forces in Europe and America had long completed their primitive accumulation, possessing the world's sharpest hedging tools and massive scale. Meanwhile, emerging markets, which hadn't even established basic financial regulation, abruptly threw open their gates under Washington's persistent pressure and their own romanticized delusions. One by one, financial behemoths began quietly sharpening their fangs right outside the fence. In the underlying logic of transnational capital, there is an unbreakable law of gravity. The tide of global capital is dictated by the baton of the Federal Reserve. In the early 1990s, to stimulate the domestic economy, the Fed slashed its benchmark interest rate to a historic low of 3%. At this moment, Mexico, having just fully embraced financial liberalization, not only removed foreign capital controls to cater to Wall Street, but also made a fatal promise, pegging the Mexican peso to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. To Western capital, this was nothing short of a banquet. Wall Street mutual funds and pensions discovered a perfect, risk-free arbitrage model. Borrow US dollars in New York at an ultra-low 3% interest rate, step across the US-Mexico border and invest in the Mexican market yielding 5% or even higher.
Later in the US
Because the exchange rate was pegged, they didn't even have to pay the cost of hedging currency risks. Over 2 years, more than $30 billion in international hot money flooded into Mexico annually. The entire nation danced joyfully inside a capital bubble. However, the Fed's tide retreats far more violently than it arrives. In 1994, to curb domestic inflation, the Fed began aggressively raising rates, which rapidly broke past 5%. When yields right on New York's doorstep hit 5%, who would want to keep their money in a volatile Mexico? Global capital began a high-stakes, race against time, great retreat. Mexico's financial system bled out instantly. Backed into a corner, the Mexican government made the classic move of any desperate gambler, doubling down on leverage. They began frantically issuing short-term dollar-denominated bonds, peso bonos, with staggering 10% interest rates, barely hanging on by borrowing new debt to pay off the old. They didn't even make it past Christmas. In December 1994, Mexico's foreign reserves were declared depleted. The peso was forced to depeg from the dollar, and it collapsed by over 40% in just 3 days. This was the first act of the global hunting game. When the Fed breathes, emerging markets end up in the ICU. Although the IMF later stepped in with a $50 billion bailout, this didn't save Mexico. Rather, it ensured that Wall Street could liquidate its core positions and escape unscathed. Worse still, this bailout created a massive moral hazard in international capital markets. Transnational capital realized that if things went south, the IMF would bail them out. Consequently, they grew even bolder. Before the ruins of Mexico could even be cleared, the torrent of capital had already shifted to the other side of the horizon, East Asia. Here, a grander and structurally more complex phenomenon played out. The yen-carry trade. In the mid-1990s, Japan was experiencing severe political and economic trauma following the bursting of its asset bubble. To keep the economy on life support, the Bank of Japan slashed domestic interest rates to near-insulting lows while the yen surged to historic highs in 1995. A global capital pipeline, wilder than the old US-Mexico border arbitrage, was born. Japanese banks and global hedge funds borrowed strong yen at virtually 0% cost in Japan, converted them into US dollars on the global market, and slammed them like a tsunami into Southeast Asia, which was then busy creating an economic miracle. By 1996, funds from Japanese banks had penetrated over half, 54%, of Thailand's total foreign debt. In Western financial textbooks, there is a specific term for this cash: hot money. Hot money never arrives for long-term infrastructure or manufacturing. They are the flash mobs of the capital world. Their sole objective is to squeeze out the highest speculative profits in the shortest possible time. Consequently, real factories in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand were neglected, while massive amounts of capital flooded into the fastest-earning sectors: finance and real estate. Skyscrapers shot out of the ground, credit bubbles inflated into monstrosities, and the entirety of Southeast Asia was intoxicated by a capital-induced illusion of high growth. But they forgot that their primary Japanese creditor was already terminally ill. In 1996, Japan's domestic banking sector sounded alarms with over $2,300 billion in bad loans. To protect domestic liquidity, the Japanese government introduced strict capital controls. With their largest creditor suddenly cutting off the supply from behind, Southeast Asia's Tower of Capital instantly lost its foundation. When a country's financial system cracks while it foolishly clings to a fixed exchange rate, in the eyes of international financial titans, it ceases to be a nation. It becomes a carcass waiting for dissection. Now, it was time for the heavy armor of Western hedge funds to take the field. Starring George Soros and his Quantum Fund. The short-selling strategies of Western speculative capital follow a textbook, industrial-grade assembly line. Step 1. Target locking. Scout for countries with massive current account deficits and fragile foreign exchange reserves that are still desperately maintaining a fixed peg. Step 2. Position building. Stealthily build up massive short positions in the forward markets. Step 3. Saturation attack. Dump astronomical amounts of spot currency onto the foreign exchange market, forcing the target central bank to burn through its reserves to defend the peg. Step 4. Media resonance. Leverage analytical reports from Wall Street investment banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to weaponize panic globally, drawing in momentum traders worldwide to form a devastating collective force for the final ambush. In May 1997, a report from Goldman Sachs became the final straw that broke the camel's back, explicitly pointing out that the Thai baht could no longer sustain its fixed peg. The flare gun fired, and 1,000 arrows flew at once. Hedge funds from New York, London, and Frankfurt swarmed out in full force. The Bank of Thailand, like a desperate Spartan warrior, cranked overnight interbank lending rates to an insane 1,500% in a futile attempt to scorch the short sellers. But this was merely drinking poison to quench a thirst. The sky-high rates pushed their own domestic real economy and financial firms straight into bankruptcy first. On July 2, 1997, Thailand surrendered, and the baht instantaneously lost 50% of its value. The dominoes began to fall in a frenzy. The Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia collapsed entirely within weeks, their local currencies plunging against the greenback like an alpine skier. Transnational short sellers went home with their pockets bursting, leaving behind a trail of ruin and astonished Asian statesmen. Drunk on their easy victories, Western short sellers grew reckless. Between late 1997 and 1998, they turned their sights 3 times toward Asia's true financial citadel, Hong Kong. This time, they deployed an even more sinister weapon, a 3-dimensional double-play strategy. They knew that the Hong Kong dollar was backed by immense foreign exchange reserves and could not be easily breached directly. Thus, they silently amassed massive short positions in the stock index futures market first, and then launched a furious assault on the currency market. When the HKMA raised interest rates out of necessity to defend the currency, Hong Kong stocks naturally tanked. It didn't matter if the currency citadel held, they would rake in fortunes from the collapsing stock and futures markets anyway. In finance, this is called a perfect double extortion. But the short sellers catastrophically underestimated the iron will of this Eastern financial stronghold. In August 1998, the Hong Kong Financial Secretary and the HKMA made a decision that sent shockwaves through Western laissez-faire economic circles. Breaking the sacred dogma of market non-intervention, they directly mobilized tens of billions in foreign reserves, marching straight into the stock market to confront Wall Street head-on. On August 28th, the battle of the century erupted. That day, Hong Kong stocks recorded a historic, jaw-dropping single-day turnover of 79.1 billion Hong Kong dollars. Behind almost every single buy order throughout the session was the steel torrent of the HKSAR government. The Hong Kong government poured tens of billions into the market over 2 weeks, clamping the Hang Seng Index in an iron grip on the futures settlement day. Speculative capital is, by nature, a bully that fears the strong. When they realized they were facing a colossus with infinite ammunition and unwavering resolve, and that the market's panic had been shattered by brute force, their only choice was to cut their losses, liquidate their positions, and flee in humiliation. Hong Kong completed its own financial Normandy counteroffensive, successfully defending its territory at a staggering cost. However, the chains of globalization are tightly intertwined. The fire was contained in Hong Kong, but it ignited into a raging inferno in Russia. In August 1998, heavily hit by the contagion of the Asian crisis and crippled by crude oil prices crashing to a miserable $10 per barrel, Russia found its deformed 150% government bond yield completely unsustainable. In a stunning move, it boldly announced the devaluation of the ruble and a default on its sovereign debt. This severe black swan of the international financial world instantly obliterated long-term capital management LTCM, America's top-tier, star-studded hedge fund backed by 2 Nobel laureates in economics, forcing it into sudden bankruptcy. Subsequently, Brazil collapsed and global commodity markets froze into absolute stasis. This 4-year global hunting game ultimately concluded with developing nations' economies left in absolute ruins and top-tier Western investment banks forcefully reshuffling their decks. 2 million people lost their jobs in Thailand. 20 million were left destitute on the streets of Indonesia. And Russia went through 6 prime ministers in a single year. When we re-examine this history through a global macro lens today, we must admit one thing. Capital itself is not a monolithic demon with a moral persona. Transnational capital is a vast collective of independent individuals, banks, hedge funds, and pension funds, each single-mindedly pursuing profit maximization. They simply aligned acutely with their profit-driven instincts and ruthlessly exploited the institutional loopholes of emerging markets. What truly demands deep reflection is the absolute financial liberalization, aggressively promoted by the Western world after the Cold War. Excessive freedom without the shield of robust legal frameworks is not a genuine market economy. It is a Roman Colosseum. You cannot expose an infant with an underdeveloped immune system directly to a wild jungle teeming with hyperviruses and then casually dismiss it as natural selection. After this cross-century financial catastrophe, emerging markets across the globe finally woke up from the economic fairy tales spun by the West. Nations began tightening regulations and frantically hoarding foreign exchange reserves like never before. Because in this brutal jungle of global finance, freedom is undoubtedly precious, but freedom without raw power is merely dressing up in your finest attire just to attend your own execution in the next hunt. That wraps up today's epic breakdown of global financial history. If you love this kind of sweeping, high-altitude macro perspective, ruthlessly hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell.